The proper role of the U.S. military in the maintenance of domestic order. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, there's been a lot of conversation in the media these days and coming out of the White House and, frankly, the Defense Department, retired generals, the Defense Secretary himself, Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, all around this issue of when and if it is appropriate to use U.S. military forces in the maintenance of order on U.S. soil. Most of those people that I listed have come out and clarified their position that it's only in the most extreme circumstances that such a thing should be done, and that we are not at the most extreme circumstances in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the peaceful protests and the riots and looting that have resulted in the aftermath. I want to focus in on one particular thing, though, because it seems the New York Times has put itself in the center of this controversy by first publishing an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton and then having a rebellion in its staff against the publishing of that op-ed. And now, as we record this morning, they are saying that they kind of rushed that without appropriate checks and balances, and it's going to result in an analysis of how many op-eds they do and what the process of vetting those op-eds is. Bill, without having to read it for all of our viewers, although I invite our viewers to go do so, it was under a headline that said, "Send in the troops." But Senator Cotton did not at any point that I could see say, "Send in the troops." What he was saying was that there is a law in the books called the Insurrection Act, and that the U.S. government is obligated, when it's called upon by the states, to protect their states or cities from domestic insurrection. In general terms, Bill, because frankly, there's so much misinformation out there, and there's, he said, she said, and things that were said by anonymous sources. Let's keep this on a broader plane and talk about when is it appropriate, if ever, for soldiers, sailors, Marines, and other members of the U.S. military to be involved in law enforcement operations in U.S. cities and states.
I think the legislation about that is relatively clear. I think it needs to be essentially an armed insurrection for it to be the Army or the Marines, for example. The reason that the president is threatening to do this is because the societal organization that we have that is made essentially for this purpose, among others, is the National Guard. But if governors and mayors won't deploy the National Guard, if they're on the side of rioters and looters, to the degree where they will not deploy the National Guard to keep cities, citizens, and property safe, then that puts the president into a particularly difficult position. I would like to say from the beginning, I think you can look at this as, and I think you need to keep this in mind, I think this entire debate is an example of the success of the structure of the government. The fact that the president cannot just simply order the army in is good. And the National Guard structure should have been employed a long time ago. And furthermore, living in Los Angeles, where the nearest boarded up businesses are about a quarter of a mile from where I live, there is no point in calling for the National Guard if you are not going to have the National Guard enforce the law. But let me just put this to you in the most philosophical and general terms, since that's how we're going to frame this issue. The National Guard needs to be called when the police fail. And as Rudy Giuliani said a couple nights ago, when he was mayor of New York, he would let people protest all they wanted to, but when somebody threw a rock at a police car, that person was arrested, and the second person to do it was arrested, and the third person to do it was arrested, and there was no fourth person to do it. So if a mayor, like the mayor we have in Los Angeles, is determined to let these rioters destroy his city, then the police force, either through political control from the top or standing orders from the political control from the top, if the police force is ordered to not interfere in looting and rioting and burning and attempted murder, then what do you think is going to happen? It's going to get bigger. And then you have to call the National Guard, which is not something you should normally want to do. That's only when the police force fails. And I'm saying that the reason the police force is failing, at least in our city, is not because of the police force, but because of the instructions that they've gotten politically.
Bill, assuming that you're correct, and assuming that there are political instructions to law enforcement officers in some cities or in some states that says, let the riots go on, nevertheless, Bill, that's still an area that is under the purview of the governor of that state or the mayor of that city. And I wonder about a conservative and frankly, a constitutionalist like yourself saying that some guy in a remote location in Washington, D.C., who happens to be president of the United States, can order the National Guard, which is really under the command of the governor of the state, to go into a situation where the governor has specifically said, I'm in charge here, I know what I'm doing, I'm accountable to my voters, and I don't want the National Guard.
Did I say that?
No, I'm wondering, though, is that how far it goes? Because you're saying that the National Guard needs to come in and reinforce the police, and you're also saying that the governors intentionally are letting this go on. Are you saying that the president of the United States can overstep the governors and call in the National Guard when the governor doesn't want them?
No.
Okay.
Not saying that. I'm trying to step up to the dilemma that the president of the United States finds himself in and why we're having this discussion on a federal level. So if the police are ordered not, and by the way, Rudy Giuliani I think he was referring to a clip that I'd seen just a couple minutes earlier. In Los Angeles, there was a building that had been broken into, and there was kind of they'd knocked a hole in either in glass or in wood paneling, plywood, whatever. And there were a number of looters inside the store, and a significant number of police arrived outside, I'd say 15 at least, in riot gear. And when the looters inside realized that the police were here, they started running out of the store, and they ran through a crowd of 15 police officers, one by one, and they didn't even slow them down. So it's not a question of that's not a question of, gee, we're not going to wade into a crowd and arrest people. Clearly, those police officers were under some kind of orders to let these people go because there were 15 police. You had to literally make your way through them like in a line at a carnival or something. So now to the next step. If the mayor's not going to enforce the law and the rule of law in his city, then it's up to the governor of the state to call in the National Guard. The mayor in Los Angeles, the city I'm most familiar with because it's where I live, the mayor called for the National Guard, but the National Guard wasn't empowered to do anything. Now, I will say this. What I began to see about 3 or 4 days ago, which is quite a shock in America, but nevertheless, these are shocking times. I live, well, I'm not going to tell you where I live, but in any event, there is a pretty upscale mall not too far from where I live. And as I was driving down the street, I noticed that there were two guys standing there in desert camouflage with AR-15s, I guess they're M4s, pointed at the ground, obviously, and at the ready. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so what basically it appears to me is that the National Guard has been deployed essentially as scarecrows to say that this area is off limits. And we're making it clear from the beginning because we're showing you our rifles here. But Donald Trump is saying that if the mayors and the governors will not protect the citizens of the cities, then somebody has to do it. And I don't think that the Army is the element for that.
And you would think, Bill, that you would also, as a conservative, not think that it's the president's role. I mean, the president can wring his hands. The president can be upset about something. The president can call upon, using the bully pulpit, mayors and governors to take action. But ultimately, if the mayor says, my strategy for dealing with this challenge is to let the looting go on because buildings and products can be replaced, lives cannot. And if we control that aspect of it, we're better off. That's apparently some of the mayor's strategy, is just to kind of let the property damage go on, contain it, and try to protect human lives. If they decide that's the way to go, then should the president do any more than basically make public calls for the governors to do what he thinks they should do?
Well, now we get to the heart of the paradox here. If a citizen of Los Angeles is going to have their property destroyed or perhaps have their lives taken from them, they are expecting to be protected by the government. They are expecting, as citizens of the United States, to have their rights respected, and these are the rights to property, rights to life, and all the rest of it. If the mayor does not enforce the rights of an American citizen to live and to protect their property, and the governor doesn't do it, then does that mean that that person no longer has the right to expect some form of enforcement of the law? This is the dilemma. If you are a citizen of these cities that are burning and your mayor is so politically, well, I'm just going to forget the first four adjectives that I come up with and just say progressive, so that they think that it's in the interest of the city to burn your property down and risk your family's life. And then the governor, also of the same political persuasion, let's just call it what it is. If Democrats would rather watch cities burn so they have a chance to win an election, and if it costs people their businesses or their homes or their lives, well, small price to pay to get rid of Donald Trump. That's the attitude. It's clear. If that's what's going to happen, then where does the citizen of Los Angeles go? Where does the guy go who's looking for some kind of protection for his business, his property rights, and his right to live? He has those rights. And if the mayor of his city is not going to enforce them and the governor of his state is not going to enforce them, then he certainly has to appeal to some kind of authority that as an American citizen, these rights which are inherent in him and not granted by any government party need to be protected. So now we get down to the actual argument. What do you do about that? Now we're on the real major issue, the actual point. Now the question is, do you use the army? I think it's bad for the army to do this. And I think that the president should be able to apply pressure to use the National Guard, which is the appropriate societal instrument for this kind of thing. And I don't know exactly what that consists of because of our system of government, which is exceedingly successful. The president of the United States does not have the legal authority to authorize he cannot force a governor to deploy the National Guard. And that's how it should be. Just from a decentralization of power, that's how it should be.
Now, I will tell you in one case, Bill, because Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed pointed out that the Insurrection Act has been invoked on what he says were dozens of occasions over time. He linked from his New York Times column, by the time you see this, maybe the New York Times will have taken it down, but he linked to a PDF document that was a study of the use of federal troops in state or local situations under the Insurrection Act over a course of decades. He says that Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson all used that primarily to enforce desegregation in the South. And there was one case, and this is specifically what you just raised, there was one case in which a governor called in the National Guard in order to keep a school from being desegregated or integrated rather. And the president of the United States then federalized the National Guard and used them to defend the rights of Black students to go to public schools that were previously dominated or only white students. So apparently, whether that's the regular course of things, it's possible for the president to do. Let's take the examples that you just gave. For the president of the United States, if he's a Democrat, as is the case with Kennedy and Johnson, to use the army to override the National Guard, which is behaving on the instructions of the governor, is precisely what we're talking about. No, they used the National Guard, frankly. I'm sorry. The governor called out the National Guard to stop the integration. The president then federalized the National Guard and said the National Guard would then enforce federal law. I'm sorry. Then that, to me, is certainly the appropriate solution. That is absolutely the appropriate solution. There was some great discussion about using the actual United States Army. And I think that's a gigantic mistake. And the reason I think it's a gigantic mistake is only because the U.S. Army is and should be trained to kill people relentlessly. That's what they should be used for, is to deploy them against our enemies, our external enemies, and use maximum lethality. And I don't expect and I don't want the U.S. Army to have to learn how to hesitate when it comes time to doing what they're trained to do. The National Guard, on the other hand, is actually the perfect instrument for this, because while they have the military training, at least to some degree, that the regular Army has, they also are much more closely tied to their community. They are, in fact, citizen soldiers. They're part-timers. So they are a perfect instrument to use for this kind of thing when it escalates beyond the power of the police to contain. And the only reason it escalated beyond the power of the police to contain was because of these progressive mayors who made that
decision based on the idea that this will somehow make them popular. In the same way that our mayor has recently allocated, nobody knows, it's $250 million to come from the police department in Los Angeles to pay to black communities. Here's your reward for rioting and burning things down. I wonder how it feels to be an LA police officer, knowing that money that was earmarked for you, perhaps your retirement, perhaps a raise, some kind of improvement of the miserable conditions that you're asked to perform under, this violent, dirty job that policemen have that they get no thanks for whatsoever. I wonder how it feels to be an LAPD officer and know that $250 million earmarked for the police is now going to communities in order to basically pay reparations for something that one cop did in Minneapolis. And I can't even imagine how that feels. But when you've got a mayor that is that out of touch, forget politics. If you've got a mayor like Eric Garcetti, who is so far away from the idea of law and law enforcement, and you could put Bill de Blasio in this box too. When you have these two idiots and these two left-wing appeasers in charge of your city, and your city is burning down, then you call the National Guard. And if they won't employ the National Guard, then I'd be perfectly honest with you, Scotty, I really will. There's an awful lot I learned from you, and one of them is that you can federalize the National Guard. I didn't know such a thing was possible. That's the honest truth. But if it is possible, and it has been used in precedent, without question, what we're seeing now much more closely conforms to what an actual insurrection is than having people walk in line and go to a school. This is clearly violent uprising and lawlessness and destruction of private property and the threatening of human life, American life. And if governors will not enforce the law in their states and the president has the power to federalize the National Guard, then not only should he do so, he should have done so a while ago, in my opinion. This is criminal. And it only happens in places like this. And it only happens with mayors like this, because there were a number of unrests under Giuliani in New York, and they simply didn't develop into anything because Rudy Giuliani, being a Republican, understood the value of enforcing the law. And finally, let me just put a button on this. The reason that these idiots like de Blasio and Garcetti tell their police not to stop these rioters, tell them to leave them alone, and so on, is because somehow these morons think that this will buy them credibility and love and acceptance, and most especially votes from the black community, when precisely the opposite is the case. The black community are the ones who are suffering the most in terms of property damage and violence and all the rest. They want the law enforced, and they don't want some stupid white liberals in skyscrapers or mansions making a decision about what an appropriate response is when people's property and lives are being destroyed. So all across the board, this is a catastrophic failure of blue government, and it follows directly on the heels of the catastrophic failure of blue government when it comes to the coronavirus issue. And to see Bill Blasio's mayor of New York, see his daughter arrested for protesting, and to see the Democratic Party's candidate for president of the United States openly saying, I'm going to give money to get looters, not protesters, looters out of jail. What do you think that does to the American people, and what kind of choice do you think that gives them come November?
I want to finish this episode with a quick clarification of my correction. So in real time, we're actually on the fly doing our own fact checking here. And this is from Tom Cotton's op-ed, by the way. So I was partially correct and partially incorrect in my correction. It says this in Tom Cotton's piece in the New York Times. He says, Governor Orville Faubus, a racist Democrat, mobilized our National Guard in 1957 to obstruct desegregation at Little Rock Central High School. President Eisenhower federalized the Guard, that part was correct, and called in the 101st Airborne in response. The failure to do so, Eisenhower said, would be, quote, tantamount to acquiescence in anarchy. He goes on to say, Cotton does, that more recently President George H.W. Bush ordered the Army's 7th Infantry and 1,500 Marines to protect Los Angeles during race riots in 1992. So
good enough for me.
Just want to bring that up to as accurate as we can make it on this on-the-fly extemporaneous program.
So So let me just close with this, and it's going to be very, very brief. The idea that Donald Trump is some kind of tyrant who's flexing his muscles, is an absolute downright lie. This is an act of desperation, and I mean legal desperation. It is a last measure act for somebody in government to protect the lives and property of American citizens. And the thing that people should be keeping in mind and constantly keeping in mind is that if this becomes necessary, it's necessary only because Democratic governors and mayors have decided that the police will not be able to enforce the laws and the National Guard will not be able to enforce the laws. And that leaves the President of the United States no choice at all. None. Well, that's not true. He has a choice. He absolutely does have a choice. He has a choice of sitting in the White House and watching America burn, or taking extraordinary legal actions in order to make sure that doesn't happen. And I'm going to go with B on this one because this is not a theoretical issue for people whose property has been destroyed, and for all of these people who were just about to come out of this California lockdown. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable and heartbreaking, and something has to be done about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful to our friends over at the Patriot Post who have provided support for this program and are offering you 2 free things. One would be regular email alerts when new content is posted at the Patriot Post, and the other, for signing up for that free email list, you get a free copy of the Patriot's Primer on American Liberty. We want to make sure you take advantage of that, so we've provided a link in the description below. We're also forever grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com who have made it possible to have this vigorous civil dialogue, sometimes agreeing with all our members, sometimes disagreeing with some of our members, but always honest as we can be with the facts as we see them on the ground. We're grateful not only for their financial contributions, but for the way they run our members-only blog, for the vigorous comments that are conducted under the video post and on the blog on this website. If you'd like to join a band of liberty lovers who will provide a fellowship of constitutionalists of conscience, then we encourage you to go to BillWhittle.com and click the big green Become a Member button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.